I'm speaking today with Molly O'Brien, the director and producer of the Academy Award-nominated short film, The Only Girl in the Orchestra. The short is about Molly's aunt, Orin O'Brien, who was the first woman to join the New York Philharmonic Orchestra. You can watch this wonderful short film when it screens at the Arts Council of White Lake as part of the Oscar-nominated documentary short screening, or you can view it right now on Netflix, where it's now streaming. Molly, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with me today, and a big congrats on the nomination.
Thank you so much for having me, Ian. I appreciate it very much.
In the documentary, you mentioned that from a young age, you really admired your aunt and wanted to live a life similar to hers. I think you said you visited her when you were like 11 and on a trip to New York. Do you recall when you made a conscious decision that you wanted to make a documentary about her?
Yes and no. It's one of those things I think many of your members of your audience have experienced, when there's just something kind of niggly-piggly just bugging you in the back of your head, just keeps coming back. You wake up thinking about it, you go to bed thinking about it. And that was it was a reoccurring dream to make a documentary film about my aunt, Orin O'Brien, for probably about 10 years. And it was just one of those voices in my head that wouldn't stop nagging me.
You've worked on a lot of documentaries. I was wondering, what are some of the challenges and maybe some of the rewards of making a documentary, specifically about someone who you know, as opposed to someone who maybe you just know as an interview subject?
It's just a lot more vulnerable when you are making a film about a family member or a friend or somebody you're personally connected to. So, for example, when I produced last year Errol Morris's documentary, Separated, which was about the Trump administration's family separation policy on the U.S.-Mexican border as a deterrent, an immigration deterrent. That felt important, and it felt, it was challenging, like all films are, all documentaries are, but I wasn't sticking my own neck out in the same way as I did for The Only Girl in the Orchestra. When you're making a film about a family member, the stakes are higher because my relationship with Orin was at stake, really. There was a lot of moments where I was very afraid that she would get mad at me and tell me to stop, or, worst case scenario, never speak to me again. Of course, the opposite is true. It's brought us closer together. It's made us co-conspirators and collaborators professionally, something that I never thought would happen. Did you ever have the fantasy? I'm sorry, I'm going to just side note. Did you ever have the fantasy of like having a father and sons, or,
Yes, of course.
O'Brien and daughters, like going into the family business and just like having that close-knit family that also runs the hardware store in town? That's a fantasy we all have. As an Irish person, when I visited Ireland, there's always the, O'Brien's pub on the corner. It's like, oh, you live above the pub, your kids work there, how wonderful. So in a sense, I didn't get the pub, but I did get to make this with Orin. She very much was a collaborator. It was an exchange between us. So it all ended up being fine, and actually better than fine. But the process was very vulnerable and risky. Yeah.
She helped a lot with the score, right?
Oh, yeah, she had strong opinions about the music. She supervised it. Laura Cartman, our composer, is also an Academy Award nominated composer in her own right prior to this film, and she is extraordinary, and she definitely was the captain of the score. But Orin, I would say, was the approver of the score. Yes.
Your aunt at times seemed maybe a reluctant participant in the documentary. How did she react to seeing the final film? Was it hard for her to watch herself?
Well, again, it was an exchange. So we didn't wait to show Orin the film when it was done. I showed her scenes, especially music scenes that included her or her students playing music. Now, of course, it's fine to show her students making mistakes and then learning from the mistakes and correcting them. She wasn't going to be erasing the truth in that way. But if there were several takes of the same piece, for example, in that opening title sequence with the disco ball, my editor and I are not classical musicians. And while I consider myself, I think I have a good ear, it's not that good. I'm not trained. So she would hear like a creak in the floor or something, the double bass falls out of tune quite easily. she would point that out and very strongly suggest that we pick a different take, which we would. Yeah.
Oh,
So she was collaborating all the way through on scenes, on cuts, on she did not have editorial control. That was mine. But she was very much a part of the creative process. It's her life that we're telling. So I think that's the right way to go.
Sure. I saw an interview with you and your aunt outside of the documentary where she was talking about music. And it was interesting to see because in the documentary, it feels like at times she's somewhat tight-lipped or maybe a little reluctant to speak. The documentary itself is sort of about her wanting to take sort of a supporting role or not as much of a visible role. But when I heard her talk about music, she gushed. It was like I hadn't seen her speak as much as she did in the documentary as she did in that interview. In the documentary, she's seen speaking with a lot of students and people. One of her students reads a profile of her that was done around the time that she was joining the New York Philharmonic. So I was wondering, was that something that you had to do in order to sort of get her to talk about herself? Was she very reluctant to speak about herself, or how did you, I guess, structure the documentary based on the subject?
The decision to not have Orin sit down in front of the camera and do a sort of a traditional talking head interview was one just born out of my experience with her, but with on other documentaries as well. You get a more organic, authentic exchange and answer to your questions when it's less formal. So yeah, set up a reunion, set up a get together, pop open a bottle of wine, have some lunch and have a conversation. That ends up being a lot more engaging, surprising, and funny. I mean, the exchange between her and Jackie Danilo, her former student, who's now a double bassist with the Metropolitan Opera. Actually, she just recently retired, but very recently. That exchange, reading the Time magazine piece and the other headlines that are just blatantly sexist, is instead of being, that sort of documentarian, like wagging your finger at those journalists, those sexist journalists, instead of that happening, which isn't really very fun to watch, it's two women who just are having a good time and laughing about it. I mean, clearly Orin doesn't love it and doesn't love reliving it, but having her friend, her student, her colleague, someone who really understands the double bass and what it is to be a woman who plays the double bass, go through that archive with her is a much more dynamic scene than just her sitting in a chair talking about it. It's just more dynamic. I'm much more interested in human relationships than I am in interrogation.
You make an appearance in the documentary as well. What was that like for you? As someone who's maybe more comfortable or familiar with being on the other side of the camera, what was that like for you?
I was reluctant, but it became very clear that the rules, the kind of general rules of documentary filmmaking, if there are any, were being broken by Orin. She was constantly breaking the fourth wall. How are you feeling? Are you cold? Molly, this is my niece, introducing me to people. Like no matter how many times I said to her when we started shooting, Orin, ignore me. I'm not here. Ignore me. She just wouldn't. So she's just not gonna go with that sort of artifice. She's not gonna play the game. Like, I'm gonna pretend like the camera guys aren't here. No, they're here and we're gonna feed them and talk to them and comment on what's happening right in front of us. So I had to be in it. It wasn't really a choice. She kind of pulled me into it. Yeah.
That's so interesting. It's really interesting given the context of her parents that she's always calling attention to the camera. That, when you guys sing her happy birthday, it was very noticeable. She turns to the camera person. Well, look, you're here too.
Yeah. The camera person's my husband.
Okay.
It's an iPhone. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what can I say? You can either be frustrated by your subject not doing what you want, or you can recognize that this is a documentary and it's not a scripted narrative. There is no script, and you need to be flexible and just fold that in. It ended up being really hilarious and endearing. She's funny.
You mentioned that Orin was a role model for you, and she offers some really good advice in the film. One is the key to happy life is to not mind playing second fiddle. And then I saw in another interview you mentioned that she told you to stay on the train. Can you explain what that means?
Sure. So, one of the reasons why that little voice in the back of my head for 10 years was saying, make a documentary about your Aunt Orin, make a documentary about your Aunt Orin, is because I saw that her philosophy of music and her philosophy of teaching is also her philosophy of life. And the two things mirror each other. It's like almost through the music, even you're saying, yes, you're right. She's reluctant to talk about sort of a lot of the details of her life outside of music, but through the music, you just learn her philosophy of how to live a happy life. And one of those sort of dictums was, the key to being a happy artist, a happy musician, a happy person is to learn to love to play the second fiddle. You don't always want to be a soloist. You don't always want to be a star, because then you just find yourself having to stay relevant and elbow people out of your way, and it's an unpleasant existence. It's much more pleasant to be part of an ensemble. And the other piece that dictum that she told me that I mentioned in that interview that you just quoted was, whenever I sort of was going through, in this particular instance, I was going through a professional difficulty a while back, and she just looked at me and said, stay on the train. If you stay on the train long enough, the landscape changes. It's exactly what happened. I stayed on the train. I've been making documentaries for 30 years, more than 30 years. And I got to direct again. It took a long time, but here I am. So, I was frustrated professionally, and she just said, keep going.
That's wonderful. Your film has so much to do with artistry and what it means to be an artist. At one point, your aunt says she thinks of herself as a secret artist, but it's like you have to pull that out of her to get her to admit that. I think that's one of the final things that she says. What advice, if any, I guess, would you share for aspiring filmmakers and artists?
Well, I wouldn't advise them to say they're a secret artist. If they want to be an artist, they should be an artist. I admire Orin for her humility, but I do think you need to declare it in order for it to really happen. I mean, I think, or at least it's easier if you declare it, put it out there. I approached this film as an experiment because I think this is true of a lot of people. Without that idea of, well, I'm just experimenting here, and I'm not putting a lot of deadlines, and we don't have to get into Sundance, and we don't have to win or get nominated for an Academy Award. None of that. Try to just like put that aside. Of course, your mind's going to go to those places that you want to be, but to just look at it as, this is a fun experiment. This is a recipe, and I'm trying out different ingredients. And so my advice to any young filmmakers is don't stop yourself with the thoughts of how am I going to get to the finish line. Just take the next step. It's an experiment. And as long as I thought about it as an experiment, and I'm experimenting, and took that pressure off, then one step it kept going. So I would just say, think of it as experimentation always. Yeah.
Is that something that was maybe unique for you on this one? Or is that something that you've always carried with you? I asked that because I saw another interview with you in which you said that you were sort of finding the film, right? And I imagine you were finding it both as you were thinking of it, as you were shooting it, and then as you were editing it.
Yep.
Is that something you always do? Or is that something that with this one, you specifically said, I don't know exactly what shape this is going to take, and I want to allow that to happen?
Listen, in general, I think films are better when the directors and the producers don't have all the answers on day one. If they have all the answers on day one, what they're doing is they're crowbarring real life as it unfolds or as it happened in the past into some preconceived 3-act structure or something like that. And I've done that, and that it works, but the films that are, it can work in that, it's entertaining, it's informative, all the things that you want a documentary to be. It doesn't, I'm not saying you can't do it that way, but keeping an open mind, staying flexible, approaching it like an experiment, not acting like you have all the answers in advance, I think usually leads to a much better outcome, because then you're open to the good stuff that may only just be a little tiny little tinkle in the back of your little tickle in the back of your head. And if you're not paying attention to that, you're not open to it, you won't catch it.
That's great. Molly, thank you so much for talking with me today. Molly's Academy Award nominated short film, The Only Girl in Her Orchestra, can be seen now on Netflix or at the upcoming Oscar nominated documentary short screening at the Arts Council of White Lake. We'll also be screening the live action shorts. Molly, thank you again for taking the time to speak with me today.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you, Arts Council of White Lake. I love that you're doing these screenings. We need you. Thank you.
Thanks.